The Gulf Coast is no stranger to disasters. Of the 10 costliest natural disasters in U.S. history, 8 are hurricanes and 6 predominantly impacted states alongside the Gulf of Mexico. Here in Houston, a litany of flood events have defined the city in recent years. Hurricane Allison in 2001, Hurricane Ike in 2008, which has given rise to the popularly named Ike Dike disaster mitigation proposal, and a series of recent floods, the Memorial Day floods of 2015, the Tax Day floods of 2016, and most prominently, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, that have put the city's vulnerability to excessive rainfall into sharp relief. And of course, as the climate changes, disasters may look different around the world, but there is no mistaking the rise in uncontrolled wildfires, severe droughts, heat waves, and stronger hurricanes and severe rainfall events. Weather disasters have become 5 times more common thanks to climate change, and there is no reason to think that things will slow down. In the wake of such disasters, though, how do we rebuild? What does recovery mean or even look like after catastrophe? The ways in which we choose to stay, relocate, or try to climate-proof our homes are shaping our cities and towns, and as more disasters strike, will only grow in importance to how we live amidst a changing world. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. Do you have a story or question about recovering from disasters? Give us a call at 713-526-5738, extension 2. At 713-526-5738, extension 2. Today on Gulf Streams, we're speaking with 3 sociologists from Rice University, all of whom have recently put out books or articles that help us to understand the ways communities recover. Dean Rachel Kimbro is the author of Into Deep, Class and Mothering in a Flooded Community. Dr. Anna Rhodes is, with Max Besbris, the co-author of Soaking the Middle Class, Suburban Inequality and Disaster Recovery, and Dr. James Elliott is the author of several widely cited articles on disaster recovery, especially focusing on racial and wealth inequalities and disaster recovery. Professors, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
So I'd like to start first just by hearing a little of what drew you into this work. So I believe that Dean Kimbro, Dr. Rhodes, I know both of you started working on this following Hurricane Harvey, which of course impacted you directly as Houstonians. And Dr. Elliott, your work goes back all the way to Hurricane Katrina, though. So I think you have a bit of a more lead on this. And I'm really curious, beyond the immediate impacts on yourselves, what first drew you into really wanting to think about how we recover from these calamities?
So I've always been interested in how people make decisions about where to live, where to raise their families, and what that looks like, and all the factors that go into those choices. And I think in the context of climate change and increasing disasters, that will more and more be a factor that people are taking into account in those decisions. And more people are going to face those choices in the wake of disaster, having to decide whether to return to a flooded home, having to decide where to go if they choose to leave one. So that was what drew me into trying to understand recovery in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, thinking about how people were navigating those choices.
I would say that my interest in urban inequality and the environment stems back to early graduate school days. And what struck me as odd back then is that it wasn't really an area that people were thinking too much about, let alone training. So it took me some time, took different routes, and then it was really during that first job at Tulane University in New Orleans where my wife worked as a healthcare worker in the city, and it was her time to sort of be in the hospital as sort of essential personnel during Katrina. And so I volunteered, and we went in, and we went through the storm in the city firsthand and rode that out. So that made a real personal impact. And at the time, I had just gotten tenure. So it was an opportunity to sort of rethink those connections. I've been trying to do that ever since.
For me, I think my work has always been about families and neighborhoods. And I happen to live next door, essentially, to a neighborhood in Houston, southwest Houston, along Brays Bayou, that flooded for the 3rd time in 3 years during Hurricane Harvey. And I just could not imagine what that was doing to the families in that neighborhood. And I knew some of them through my kids' school. And so I wanted to really dig in and find out what the impact of experiencing something like that really was on a family.
And I think something that really runs across all of your work is that these impacts aren't the same, right? Really across certainly class, which I think we would expect there to be different responses to, but especially race, even gender in your work, Dean Kimbro. I mean, it's really kind of staggering to think about some of these different responses. And so maybe just to start us off, I'm wondering about, can you give us the overhead view of what is the difference? How are we seeing, we think of recovery of a city. How does it wind up that we have such unequal, and in what ways that you're looking at? Because you're all looking at very different ways that people are also grasping with these recovery processes. If you can just walk us through that a little.
So one of the most fun things about working on this project actually was getting to talk to Anna and Max about their work as they were developing their book as well, because we were seeing different things. We were looking in different types of communities. The neighborhood I was focused on is a highly educated, definitely upper middle class, affluent community. And what was really striking was how much support they had immediately following the flood in terms of recovery. They also had financial resources they could draw on, as well as extensive social networks that really came out of the woodwork to help them get things cleaned up and fixed. That did wane a few weeks after the storm to some degree, and the recovery process was very, very long. But the families in my book mostly had the resources they needed to recover, in flood insurance, importantly.
So I think for our book, thinking about suburban communities, we were also in a majority white, sort of upper middle class community. And I think what struck me over 2 years of talking to families in that community is that we know, and Dr. Elliott can speak to, differences between communities and growing inequality between communities in the wake of disaster. But I think we often have assumed that sort of more affluent majority white spaces are almost like a best case scenario community in terms of access to resources, as Rachel was saying. But we saw over time in this community that inequality grew within the community. So we are missing something around how we're addressing needs in recovery, not only in our poorest communities, but sort of across the spectrum. And we're going to see increasing inequality even in those places that we often think of as receiving the most assistance in the wake of disaster. So it was just highlighting that this is an ongoing policy challenge that we're going to need to address head on because we aren't quite getting it right anywhere at this point.
And I would just add to that these types of questions are relatively new. After Katrina, I was really interested in what was going to happen next and impatiently wanted to look out 5, 10, 15 years later. And when I went and looked at the existing literature on this, I found that most of the attention was paid in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the disaster. The questions were, okay, how do people come together or not during these events? What should interventions look like in terms of emergency response? And the bigger questions of what happens going forward weren't really at the fore of this. So the types of research that Dr. Rhodes and Dr. Kimbro are talking about is the new generation of this sort of research. And a pivotal question is not just in the case of Katrina and Harvey and other disasters of whether or not these events pull back the veil of everyday life to reveal pre-existing inequalities, but now the question is, do they actually begin to contribute to and exacerbate these inequalities going forward in the ways that we sort of come in long term after the reporters have gone and the hard work of recovering over the long term sort of proceeds.
And I really want to, thank you for drawing our attention to something that I think you're already touching on, which is just how long these processes are. I mean, I know in your work you've been looking at communities for years. I also work on disaster recovery and kind of take a long longitudinal study and find, okay, this is. Yeah, there's when the reporters leave, there's when the kind of prominent tourist zones of a place are back up and running, but at a neighborhood level, yes, this is years and years. We can look at Louisiana post-Ida, and we can see communities in, kind of western Louisiana that are still recovering years on. And so, I think some of that, I would just love to hear about your experience of the scale of time that it takes for recovery, but also how that's not equally distributed, because I know some folks, and particularly Dr. Rhodes and Dean Kimbro, your books really explore. Some people are able to move back and kind of, proof their homes for these events. and some aren't. And then I think Dr. Elliott will talk a lot about, where people wind up moving to. But yes, if you can walk us through some of what does this process of recovery actually look like, and what are things that we're missing when we just kind of take the headlines.
So when I started my project, I initially thought that I would interview mothers once and kind of get their in-depth storm stories. And then as I began talking to them and absorbing everything they were going through and realizing just how long it was going to take them to get back in their homes, which was their number one goal, I realized that I really needed to talk to them again. And so I interviewed everybody again a year later. And if I hadn't done that, I would have missed so much of the storm story. At the beginning, the first interviews, everybody was really focused on money and, insurance and how they were going to pay to elevate their home, for example. And I wasn't expecting that. And then in the second interview, everybody was very focused on family conflict, particularly with their husbands, and that had just accumulated over the course of the year, a very, very trying year for the family. And so I heard a whole lot about that. And I think it just illustrates the longevity of this. Something you go through something like this, and it's not over. Even when you move back into your renovated home, it's still not over. You're still trying to figure out how to pay for things and very concerned about the future as well, of course.
Well, maybe we can take a moment here, because I think when we think of recovery, we, sadly expect there to be differences probably along class lines, probably along racial lines. But I think that, it's really fascinating to think of your book, In Too Deep, which focuses on motherhood, but also just on a kind of feminist read of disaster recovery, and really is attentive to the fact that within families, distribution of how we're recovering, what that labor looks like is unequal. Can you talk a little about that for a moment?
Sure. I thought it was interesting, although definitely in line with other sociological research, that the wives definitely espoused non-traditional gender views in the sense that they thought, men and women can contribute equally to the household. But when push came to shove and they had to get their house back in order, the women took on by far the most work. So they were meeting the contractor, they were going by the house to pick up mail, they were making decisions about the design and all of that. And when I asked them if that had been negotiated with their husbands or just assumed, they kind of looked at me like, well, of course I would do it because I'm the logistics person, as one of them told me. But that was the central source of the conflict between the couples. The wives were really, most of them worked full-time outside the home, so they felt like they were working 3 full-time jobs to get the house back. And that caused lasting issues, for sure.
And so then broadening out, something that I want to go back to is you did hint at the issues of insurance. And I know this is something we've thought a lot about, and especially communities that have recently gone through Harvey, probably very familiar now. But there are these constant recurring stories of not realizing we needed flood insurance, not understanding what flood insurance means and how it's different from homeowners insurance. And so maybe Dr. Rhodes, can you walk us through a little bit some of your work on just hearing from these families, the way that they're thinking through insurance and the realizations and the inequity that winds up kind of contributing to?
Yeah, so we talked to 59 households, and there were a large number of them who were not insured when Harvey hit. And some of that was people who were aware and didn't have the financial resources to pay for insurance, so they sort of let it lapse, hoping they would be able to pay that bill at some point. Others got bad advice, and they were in, say, the 500-year floodplain and weren't necessarily mandated to have that coverage, and had a real estate agent or a friend or someone they trusted say, oh, you're unlikely to flood, and then not opt in to that insurance and really deeply regret it. And when Harvey hit and they were facing that challenge, to rebuild their property in the absence of those insurance dollars. And that was a major driver of the speed and completeness with which people were able to put their properties back together. So we saw that those who were insured, sometimes it took a little while longer for them to actually get a significant number of dollars. The sort of FEMA aid would appear relatively quickly for households. So sometimes it was the uninsured who sort of jump-started the process, but those dollars didn't last very long. So folks were often unable to put their full property back together. They might have one working bathroom but not another. They might have a couple of rooms, but some rooms with no drywall still. We talked to one household that just never was able to put flooring back in, so they were older folks living in a home with cement floors, which they talked about as being sort of a health hazard for them and the risk of falling. One of them had fallen. So they were negotiating that. And in the absence of the insurance money, they simply ran out of funds. So we see that becomes a major factor in driving how that recovery process unfolds over time and the speed with which people are able to sort of get their properties put fully back together. And that was one major change that we saw in the wake of the storm. So a lot of folks didn't choose to move. They chose to return and rebuild and stay in their homes, but they got insurance if they didn't have it. And that was the sort of transition that folks were making to try and be prepared for the next storm.
And if I can just hop in there, the insurance issue gets back to the earlier question of how long is the recovery and does it ever end? And we see this in discussions even of the COVID-19 pandemic. Is it over? Is it not? But the insurance signals and operation is really stretching this out to the extent that people will talk about insurance and its complexity and its increasing cost as being scarier than the next storm, right? So that there's an uncertainty of how much you should get, whether it'll be available, and what type you should get, as Dr. Rhodes was talking about. I mean, think about here and along the Gulf. You've got homeowners insurance, which protects you from certain wind coverages and rain coming in through, a compromised
For window
roof.
breaks or something, yeah.
Exactly. But that's not flood insurance. So then you get flood insurance. So both of those rates are going up. And so the federal flood insurance program, we already know, is increasing over time. So there are many more people who are not in the situation that Dr. Rhodes mentioned in her community, where they're simply not able to afford the insurance and are basically going what they call bare and waiting for the next disaster and have it make the decision for them. And so this is the world where we're increasingly entering.
And I feel like, just speaking to Katrina and in your experience in New Orleans, I grew up in New Orleans, I lived through this, and I mean, this was all of us kind of recognizing overnight, oh, what does homeowners insurance not cover? There were countless stories about people realizing the necessity of flood insurance in that kind of catastrophe, not being able to, and now we see it here with Harvey. And so I'm wondering, is this just a lesson we have to continually learn in this really, really painful way, or are there ways that we should be thinking about how we address both the insurance market more broadly, which is already under a lot of strain? We see quite a few states where insurers are pulling out, insurance rates are skyrocketing because of disasters. Is this the time to think seriously about how we're handling insurance and catastrophes, maybe nationally, certainly regionally?
Absolutely. And not because we need to do that as residents and citizens and homeowners and renters, but because the insurance companies are already doing this, and the people who insure the insurance companies, the reinsurance market is already doing this. So it's a fundamental shift. I mean, this is why FEMA has already begun to adjust upward the cost of its flood insurance, because basically it is an institution that's going bankrupt and it can no longer afford to subsidize the coverages in the same way. So we have an increasing need from a growing number of folks for this type of insurance, and yet the access to that is going down through increasing prices. So that begins to introduce other ways to intervene that we might get into. One of them is sort of moving that recovery process out, so it includes things like mitigation, or actually paying people to remove themselves from harm's way and make decisions about what that does in terms of saved equity and community attachments and the like.
And so can you say more about mitigation? Because I think this is something that runs throughout, is really what are people doing when they receive those funds? We've talked a little bit about, receiving them. I think we should also flag that across your work, there's a real attention to the different levels of resources that enable people to really go for these, different pockets of money. But I mean that in a very real way of, we see folks who have the time at home to really be competitive and put together every piece of paper and go through every detail, are able to get a lot more out of the system than those who are trying to work 40 or 50 hours a week, maybe stay-at-home parents. These folks who don't have that luxury of time and resource are being disproportionately impacted and not accessing perhaps what they're deserving of. And so what does that mean, both in terms of, I guess that's the twofold question of, one, if you want to say more about what that process of actually getting the money looks like, but then where is it going, and how are people mitigating afterwards?
So in my book, the mothers indeed this was part of the gendered labor they were doing. They were, documenting photos, they were finding receipts, they had extensive Excel spreadsheets that they shared with me, which must have just taken them hours and hours and hours to put together. And then they were also haggling with the insurance companies as well, back and forth. No, this was this kind of tile, not that kind of tile. It was an immense amount of labor. But as you say, while it was very challenging for them and they were doing lots of other things at the same time, they got it done and they got their money eventually from the insurance companies. In terms of mitigation, many of them ended up raising their homes, which cost kind of a minimum of $250,000. They paid for that from a variety of ways, including Small Business Administration loans to make that happen. But remember, in this case, it's the third time in 3 years. Some of the women in my book, 7 of them, this was the third flood in 3 years. And for many of them, it was the second flood. I do think it raises tough questions about how many times we're going to rebuild homes in that particular neighborhood and others in Houston that repetitively flood, and what it means to continue investing in a community that is so at risk. And it's a really tough question. The book tries to grapple with it. I'm not sure it comes to any great conclusions there. It's tough.
It is. If you had the answer, I would almost be concerned because I don't think there is a single answer. But yeah, no, I think that both highlights something that runs across these bodies of work that you've come up with around, yes, that demand of time, and how I think something that both Dr. Rhodes and Dean Kimbro, your work really speaks to is actually it's really important that we look at some of these upper middle class communities to understand they're actually getting the resources. Why are they able to get the resources? You say a Small Business Administration loan, and I'm sitting here going, I would never have ever thought to even apply for one of these, and the kind of networks that enable money to go to certain pockets of communities and we know don't go to other ones. And so I think that's a really significant point about how this money is able to flow. So yeah, in terms of mitigation, in terms of how people are recovering, I don't know if anybody wants to talk about what did, perhaps just to focus on Harvey and say, how did people recover from Harvey? What were the different options and what did people do?
So compared to the community Dean Kimbro was studying, we actually didn't see a lot of people raise their homes or take major sort of mitigation steps with their properties. And that was largely driven by the cost. They simply couldn't afford to do it. There was only one home in one of the sort of neighborhoods right at the entrance to the neighborhood, and everyone I talked to was like, have you seen the house? They lifted it like 8 feet. But it was this very notable sort of standout property because that was not something that people could really afford to do. There are some instances where you can't return to your property without mitigating if your risk is high enough, and so that's going to become potentially sort of a policy consideration down the line as risk increases. But the expense is a real issue for mitigation efforts, and the Small Business Administration loans can allow people to get back in their properties. The problem is, in some respects, that you can have 2 neighbors, and we did, next door to each other, one with insurance that was able to rebuild, one that took out a Small Business Administration loan to rebuild, and their properties look really similar, but one family is now over $150,000 in debt. And you can't tell from the outside of these beautiful homes that that's true. But they're worried about the financial ramifications of that new loan for saving for their kids' college. They have a $400 new monthly expense that they have to pay down starting a year after that loan was first issued. And so it can really change the sort of financial security and dynamics of households. So yes, in theory, you have access to something that helps you put your property back. But in practice, it can introduce sort of new financial inequalities within a community and new financial challenges for households that last for a very long time. So I think there's some caution to think we can sort of insure our way or SBA loan our way out of the broader challenges that we're facing. And so we're going to need a combination of policies and practices that are not just at the level of the homeowner, right, but thinking about broader strategies around mitigation that will move beyond that sort of individual household level.
And as individual households and families make these important decisions, right, they're doing it amidst this collective trauma that's been mentioned, right? So they're working through other issues, but as you go further and further down the recovery line, what the data suggest is that those have community effects, right? So if you are able to get an SBA loan and rebuild or elevate and improve. Oftentimes what that does is it improves the value of the homes in that community, and that begins to generate more equity and more returns on wealth, whereas communities where the majority of homeowners cannot sort of engage in those types of mitigation strategies, you see a downward trajectory. So one of the things we've been interested in nationally is seeing, are there general trends that we can peel out across the country, across different scales of disaster? And what the data show is that's precisely what's happening. On average, the wealth inequalities in this country by race, but also by homeowner, renter status, by education, get exacerbated the more disasters damage the areas, because you have people who can rebuild, they begin to rebuild the community itself goes up, or vice versa, it goes in a downward trajectory, which then sort of puts an onus, if you will, on federal interventions and state interventions. And so when we looked at that, what we found is that the more federal money that goes into a general area that's been impacted by a disaster, the worse that polarization actually gets. There's something about the way we recover through market mechanisms that privileges property over community, and it just drives this forward. So if you put more money into that system, it just keeps doing more of the same faster.
I think that's really significant as well, because one of the things that you all address is the role of social ties in really how communities rebuild and how important that community actually is to that recovery process. And so, I think certainly we do see examples in all of your work where people relocate and move to somewhere else. But at the same time, we see a lot of people who are able to just move in, and particularly with Harvey, a lot of folks who really did immediately come back, in comparison to, say, Hurricane Katrina, where you have a huge exodus of population, and also thinking of kind of California wildfires, where there's really nothing to come back to. Those social ties become so fractured that community recovery is really, really under strain. Can you talk some about what is that role of community, how important are these social ties, but then how that can contribute to some of these things that we're talking about?
So I should say at the outset that I'm fond of economists. Some of my best friends are economists. However, when I was working on my book, I was talking to an economist, and he said, well, obviously, they need to just sell at a loss and get out of there. And I thought to myself, maybe on paper, yes, but I knew that that was not what they were going to do. And in this case, the book makes the argument that these mothers and families had chosen this neighborhood very specifically for its school, its location, and it was they thought it was a, quote, nice family neighborhood. And they were not going to give that up just because of these floods. They thought they had found one of the best places in the city to raise their kids, and that was really important to them, and they were going to stay. And that's, in fact, what they told me.
I think we found sort of similar things talking to folks as well. And one thing that stood out was that in the aftermath of a flood, in the absence of having already thought about where you might move, or having sort of a viable alternative or a sense of a community that you could move to that might offer you the similar kinds of things that are important to you, it's really hard to make the decision to say, okay, we're going to pick up and sell at a loss and move, right? And so there is this challenge when people have the resources to be very intentional about deciding where to live. The storm doesn't change those things, right? The storm changes how your property looks and what you have to do to rebuild and return, but it doesn't necessarily remove those ties. It doesn't change the school your child would attend. And so I think in that context, in the absence of people having some capacity and assistance to think through, like, where else could I go where I might be able to also have similar things that were really important to me, it's going to be really hard for people to make that decision to leave all of that behind in a quick timeline.
And that's where we're getting into that fundamental reality that homes don't just have economic value, right? Mm-hmm. They have powerful social value. And those values come from ties and commitments. One of the interesting things we found recently as we're studying FEMA's buyout program, this is the program where repetitive flooded homeowners can, if approved, sell their properties and get out of harm's way, right? And what we found through a national study of thousands of these folks that we tracked down is even when they do decide to move, that power of community and social value is strong. The average person who takes FEMA up, or a local flood jurisdiction up on this policy, moves an average of about 6 miles driving distance. So they're still able to go to the same restaurants, to the same schools, to the same sort of routines. What they've done is effectively just try to move to a safer spot. This gets away from this notion of this apocalyptic climate migration where people are suddenly, moving long linear distances up to, climate-proof Duluth. What they're doing is they're moving around and trying to find ways to maintain those ties and reduce risk. And if they can't do both, or they can't afford it, then oftentimes they do stay in place and do what they can to mitigate or, think about alternative plans when the next storm comes.
So I absolutely hear that, and I'm, as someone who's lived on the Gulf Coast my whole life, I'm very sympathetic to that. I will throw out the challenging question of, is that sufficient in places that we know, thinking specifically of, coastal Louisiana here that is literally melting away, right? Is 6 miles enough, or is this just buying a decade? Is this buying 2 decades? These are really hard questions to grapple with, right? But there is a reason people are talking about real migration as a solution to some of these scenarios where we know we're going to continue to see disasters. And I'm curious what your feeling is on that. Are there strategies we should be looking at that are not just moving people, or is this something we're going to have to absolutely consider for places?
Right. I thought you were just
Here's
going to
my
ask
tough
us simple
question,
questions,
sorry.
Wesley. Thanks for that one.
Yeah, I am talking with 3 PhDs, so I felt like I could give you one one challenging one.
I'll say what folks probably already know intuitively, which is the solutions are going to have to be varied, right? We're going to have a mix of tools in the toolkit and work with communities so that those involved actually have a say in what's happening. At the same time, there's certain economic parameters. So you might have a high social value of your house down on coastal Louisiana, but the latest research shows that banks are increasingly not going to lend for those because they become basically economically insolvent if the person forecloses or has to leave in a storm. And so those pressures are going to begin to be, I think, the wedge that sort of drives some of these questions home in certain places. And so the question is, can we be proactive ahead of schedule? So one of the things that I think is promising is that FEMA is engaging in these new policy tools known as CEDARs, or Community Disaster Resilience Zones, where they're identifying areas that might be a little lower on sort of social resources and economic resources, but are high environmental risk, and working with those communities proactively by channeling real resources into there and having them be able to make decisions over 3-5 year span, but really including those folks in the decision making and in the planning. So maybe it's a little bit of managed retreat, as they call it, from certain areas that are more flood prone, but efforts to build affordable housing in other parts of the community where they can maintain those ties.
I think that's right, and I think there's like we saw in our work that the people who were willing to move, the ones who made those moves, were the ones who had thought about it ahead of time. So if we can start those conversations in communities of extremely high risk and engage them in how to think through what mobility away from that risk might look like, I think we can land on something that's a workable solution that does move people out of harm's way. But we have to take the long view about that as opposed to like a reactive, responsive view, because people are going to really push back if they feel like they're being forced to make decisions that they don't have any role and participation in. I think the other thing that comes up a little bit in some of the current structure right now is buyouts, but the timeline that people have to wait to find out if they can even get those resources is incredibly long. So we talked to a few people who were sort of open to that kind of mobility, but in the end, they didn't have the financial capacity to sort of hold out and sort of wait. They needed somewhere to live in the meantime. And so we have a challenge with our existing policies, I think, in some respects, in how we're creating opportunities for people to choose to move who might be more open to it. And if that was easier and we were engaging high-risk communities with conversations about where they might go, where you might be similarly able to access the kinds of schools and neighborhood contexts that you wanted, I think we might see people more open to mobility in some communities, at least, than it seems like on paper right now.
I agree, and I think one of the things that might have worked in the community I was studying, is the thing the mothers were really stuck on was they had moved to this particular neighborhood for the particular school in the neighborhood. Well, why couldn't HISD have grandfathered their kids into that school so they could have moved somewhere else and still gone to that school? That could have gotten some more people to move, I think. So it's important to understand, our policymakers need to understand that why people choose to live where they live and why they think about moving, and not just think that it's just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's not. It's people, it's community, and it's those social ties that we were talking about.
I think that's so valuable, and thank you, because I think focusing on these community-led responses, really engaging, not thinking so much necessarily federal down, right, but really allowing communities to have voice in these considerations. As you point out, if it's a 6-mile move, in coastal Louisiana, that might not be sufficient. In Houston, that's a huge difference, and that's a really significant one. And that idea that absolutely something as simple as grandfathering students in could enable that. I mean, I think that kind of localized thinking is really, really crucial in this conversation, and often not something we pause to really consider. So I really appreciate that. Something that I also found running through your work that I wanted to touch on, because I think it's just fascinating, and I'm curious to hear if you have more to say about it, is particularly in your books, you do a huge number of interviews, you talk to people over years, and one of the things that kind of runs through both is a comment on folks who seem very aware that climate change is a reality, that climate is changing, and yet don't necessarily recognize the risk that might represent for them, and don't necessarily think of themselves as being entangled with that, at least at the flooding level. And so I'm curious if you want to talk about some of your experience just in these conversations, but also what that means for us as we think about wherever we are, how that affects us, and how we need to be thinking about what a changing climate realistically means for the places we live in.
I think that it's hard for humans to understand risk. And even people who had flooded twice in 3 years told me they didn't think they would flood again at the end of my project. And I really struggled to understand that.
Yeah.
But then again, it's 2023 and they haven't. So, maybe they were right. But I think we tend to imagine that the next storm will be like the storm that happened before. And I think that impacts the way we think about our own personal risk going forward. I think the mothers in my book understood that it was a risk to stay in the neighborhood, but it was one they were willing to take because they wanted their kids in that place.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that we benchmark to past storms is something we need to be having a lot more conversation about, because we do say, well, if this house didn't flood during Harvey, then I can buy it and I'm probably safe, not necessarily taking into account how a changing climate might make the next storm different from Harvey. And so I think that too affects sort of how people are thinking about risk. I think with our folks, we heard a lot from them that they sort of understood that they still had some risk. You couldn't deny the risk because their homes had flooded in the past. And the change that they made wasn't one to say, like, okay, I have to get out, but instead to say, if it happens again, then I would really consider moving. So their willingness to relocate does seem to sort of adjust to some extent. Now, Dean Kimbro's book would suggest that people might be willing to stay through several, but I do think over time, there is some element of change and sort of openness given repeated exposure to disaster. I also think that there's more common ground in people's discussion about flood risk than there might be in people's discussion about climate change, or at least human activity's role in climate change. I found that to be really interesting. People with really different politics or really different perspectives could talk about flood risk in a sort of similar kind of shared way, even if they would react very differently to the language of climate change. And so I think that's something we also need to be engaging with, is finding that common ground and understanding how we might see different flood risk over time and what kinds of decisions we want to be making as communities and as households in the face of that, and try to sort of stay away from the political trigger words that are climate change and instead draw people together to the table to have real conversations about what we need to do locally.
And to some extent, I mean, I think that brings us back to, might feel like a bygone era these days, but, all politics is local, right? And that we can perhaps have a more abstract idea of climate change and the global, but that really local focus on something like flooding in Houston really can allow people to speak across these different issues from different perspectives. Dr. Elliott?
No, I was just going to get back to the risk question, which is absolutely local, right? It's your community that you live in, but it's also your house, right? So even if you're unable to sort of think about the climate risks and the complex modeling that goes in there, you will see a higher insurance bill, right? You will begin to adjust your sort of concern level based on that. And that was one of the things we were interested in, pulling back and looking at this relocation. So we followed almost 10,000 folks across the country who engaged in this FEMA buyout program. And we were really interested in, as they move, were they just moving because it was time to move and they had the plan and this was, the flood sort of accelerated that plan? That could be possible, but we were also thinking about, regardless, were they reducing their risk? And so we got these household level, address level flood factor scores from a foundation, and we were able to look at that question, and we were somewhat surprised because the risk messaging is getting in there, not just on where to move from, but where to move to. And what we found is that people were reducing their flood risk on average about 65% through this. So again, through very local moves. So they aren't moving to some entirely new region. They are trying to figure out other places around their community where they can make this decision. But then we're in a game of musical chairs. How many homes are there? Who gets to make that decision? And we're back to the toolkit and having a number of different options for folks.
Well, and as places change over time, those flood patterns change as well. At one point, our 100-year floodplain, 500-year floodplain made sense. It doesn't anymore, and that's changing rapidly. And as we continue to build out into the exurbs and eat up flood-retaining zones around the city, that it has a downstream influence, we've talked about pretty extensively in past episodes. I mean, I think that ongoing shift is something that we're going to have to continue grappling with. I do think I want to highlight a statistic from the Kinder Institute, which has consistently found post-Harvey that a majority of Houstonians support not allowing people to continue to remove and buy properties that have flooded multiple times. And so that's only post-Harvey. That was not at all a majority of Houstonians pre-Harvey. And so I think everything you're saying points to absolutely a kind of recognition that things are changing and that values around these issues are changing as well. So I just, before I have to let you go, I do want to ask about what are some of the solutions you'd like to highlight or steps that you think are necessary or things that you want us to be aware of for moving forward. We know disasters will continue to occur. We know this is going to be an ongoing, certainly nationally and regionally, but globally, an issue that we have to deal with. So as we think through this long future of disaster recovery, I'm sorry, this has been a bit heavier than I was expecting, but it is the disaster recovery episode. So what are things we should do to go in more prepared and to be thinking strategically about what we can do to be better at this?
I would say think about social institutions. Think about schools, think about churches, synagogues, etc. Those are the things that people have ties to. How can we think about relocating those things as well, or creating new versions of those things where people need to go?
Right, that's fundamental. And Dr. Rhodes hit it on the head earlier, just extending the time horizon, right? We are moving to what they call the new abnormal. It is not, are we going to have a new Harvey or another Harvey or a Memorial Day flood? We are accelerating the trajectory on this. So we need to plan for 30, 50 years out in doing this. And we can do that. We've got the resources. We've got the know-how. We've got plenty of smart people in this city. And so being able to think collectively on this, and maybe it starts with something fundamental like rethinking how resources and communities are conceptualized. So one way might be to think about watersheds as a basis of community and what happens in there, and partnerships across otherwise sort of disparate neighborhoods that are part of that same sort of geologic or hydrologic sort of feature, and begin to sort of resource those things. Money is a great source of commitment and glue, if you will, to pull people together and sort of sort through these things. I think that's the key, though. We have to be consistent in providing resources to actualize some of this planning to make it real. And this is where FEMA, at least in the blueprint, is trying to go further and think about needs and metrics, not just in terms of need, but also thinking about outcome metrics. Can we begin to hit thresholds where we think together about which institutions we work with, how do we reduce flood risk, and actually shoot for some goals that we articulate and work together on?
I think I'll talk a little bit about sort of thinking about it at the individual level. And so I think for all of us as Houstonians, like thinking through and paying attention to the risk to your home, and paying attention to what resources are available to you in terms of insurance and things like that, and taking those considerations with you to the ballot box as you think about who you want to represent you locally and how they're focused on trying to address these issues, and incorporating that into the broader considerations you have as we sort of build out our local politics and think through what we're looking for.
Well, Dr. Rhodes, Dr. Elliott, Dean Kimbro, this has been so enlightening and informative, and an important, difficult topic, but I really appreciate your time and your thought on this, and some of this really invaluable discussion around how we continue to think about the places we live and what the future holds for them. So thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah,
Thank you.
All right. So now we're going to go over to Jaden Bray-Boyce, one of our researchers who has a segment this week on wildfires. So we'll be switching disaster topics over to a related issue, but a different kind of disaster than we normally see in Houston.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Recently, I had the honor of speaking with the Consul General of the Republic of Cyprus concerning wildfires. From our discussion, I aim for all of you to gain a broader understanding of wildfires on a global scale. So without further delay, let's dive right into it. So wildfires are affecting countries worldwide, each with their own unique repercussions. However, for a small island such as Cyprus, how do these severe wildfires specifically affect the local communities?
As you said, Cyprus is small, which means that the area is contained. It's also an island. So we don't have wildfires like you had in the U.S. recently, but fires are a problem, and we've had them for at least 30 years now. Every season, like every summer season, and it's getting worse because we're experiencing a lot more dry seasons, which means not enough rain, which means that the type of trees that we have in Cyprus, like pine, are if they don't get enough water during the year, they become even more flammable than they normally are, and pine trees are, and you know that in the United States as well. I mean, it's the slightest spark will just lights it up like it's a Zippo. It's amazing, and so it's been there are two things I can tell you about. One of them is that it's a problem that we are trying to tackle for at least 15 years now, regionally. In other words, there's a lot of support that goes to other countries nearby that have fires. They had huge fires, for example, in Israel about 6-7 years ago. And we sent firefighters, we sent aircraft. They came in from Italy, they came in from Greece, they came in from Egypt. In Cyprus, we often get help from Israeli aircraft, sometimes from Greece, depends on how bad the fires are. So that's one thing. So there's a regional component to it. And the European Union has become a lot more involved in terms of financing certain reaction capabilities, but particularly Mediterranean countries. The other thing is you need to prepare the ground, because some of the areas are very difficult to access with traditional means of like firefighting vehicles. So there's the mountains are full of fire lanes that have two purposes really. One of them is to give greater access to the fire trucks, but also to create buffers between the fires so they won't be able to spread from one side to the other. But you know, we this summer one fire that comes to mind. Apparently, it was an electrical power cable that broke and sparked a fire, and it was a fire in a forest that is pretty pristine, and it was very difficult to get to it. We were lucky that we managed to contain it. Usually, that happened by means aircraft, helicopters, and stuff. But it's, you know, a lot of this depends on introducing new technologies now. So there's a lot more drone technology being introduced in being able to detect quickly. There are forest guards who, you know, they have positions in top of hills, and they keep an eye on. But there's never enough people. The whole system relies a lot on volunteers, locals, and they're doing a fantastic job. But you know, it's a problem that we just feel it's only getting worse. We need to buy more aircraft to be able to respond quicker. So that's in a nutshell the situation.
Expanding on this topic, this is a multi-part question, but how does Cyprus approach the process of asking for aid from other nations? I'm aware that Israel, Jordan, Greece, and Lebanon played a part in mitigating these wildfires. Did Cyprus make a formal request for assistance, or was this support offered voluntarily? Additionally, what are the ramifications of foreign countries stepping in to offer assistance in these circumstances?
So first of all, there's a mechanism which has been in place. And essentially, you know, if the particular country feels that they need extra help, they trigger the mechanism and immediately, you know, it's been done now for many years, so it's no longer people know what to do. It's not a strange thing. I mean, I remember the really big fires in Israel. It was the first time that they had aircraft from other countries come in. And it's not a country that was used to having so many foreign aircraft there. And it involves, every country has its own security regulations. So, for example, in Israel, you need to have a local pilot who essentially he controls the radios. So but it's pretty automatic now. And Cyprus is obviously, because of its location, it's there usually at least 12 hours before anybody else gets there, whether it's in Israel or in Egypt or in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Greece. Well, Greece, of course, has the advantage that it can also get people coming by road that drive in from the Balkans. So that's that. To answer your question, there's a mechanism that is triggered. Usually, in most cases, it's the ministries of interior who deals with these things. They have forestry or the ministries of agriculture, depends, and they just, you know, they have points of contact, and they just, you know, call up, and immediately there's a response. Politics, listen, things are getting a lot better, but I'll tell you the experience that we had in Cyprus. Often there are fires in the occupied north, and the Turkish military, for example, will not allow our people to go in there to help out, which is an issue. There are times where the situation was so bad that they they did acquiesce. So we managed to get usually firefighters as opposed to aircraft. We, on the other hand, are very we're also very careful about this because sides try to take advantage of it to make political gains or political statements. So it's not an easy thing to arrange. But I was, I have to tell you, when I was serving in the embassy in Israel, I was in one such occasion. I was very. This was back in, I think, 2016. It was heartwarming to see that that Egypt had sent two helicopters, that the Jordanians had sent aircraft. So things are things that normally weren't normal for many years now. Even though there's been a peace agreement, they're becoming more and more acceptable and can be done in public.
It is more than likely that nations around the world are grappling with these significant financial challenges as they allocate resources to combat wildfires. Therefore, if regions popular among tourists are combating wildfires, how does this affect the revenue from tourism? Cyprus, for instance, generated over $1.5 billion in tourism during a 6-month period this year, and on average, tourism accounts for approximately 20% of the nation's GDP, according to the International Trade Administration. So that being said, what potential impact, if any, could this have on the overall economic situation of Cyprus?
Well, we haven't had, as I said, we didn't have wildfires the way that you recently had, for example, in Greece or in California. So the vast majority of the tourist resorts are on the coast, while the forests are in the mountains. So we haven't seen immediate impact. It doesn't mean we're not concerned about it. It doesn't mean that, because it's an ecosystem. You want to be able to preserve the ecosystem and improve it and help it. And so obviously, if you're going to have a huge fire, you're going to have a lot of smoke. But we haven't seen that impacting the tourism tourism sector. Tourism sector is usually impacted, in Cyprus at least, it's usually impacted by bad economic situation in those countries where people come, or wars. Like if there's greater instability in the area, if there's, for example, in the Gulf Wars, there was a drop in tourism for obvious reasons because people were scared to leave, etc. So we haven't experienced a climate change impact on tourism yet. Of course, we talk about fire, but the temperatures are rising. We're having hotter summers, and you have a lot more people who are susceptible to heat stroke, to ulcers. So that obviously has an impact, and we've also seen rising temperatures of the waters, so in the sea, which impacts it impacts fishing, it impacts other life in the water. So it's a complicated it's a complicated situation to balance. But as far as fires are concerned, yes, there's a cost, a growing cost. We need more means. We spend a lot of money on leasing helicopters, for example, to be able to boost our aircraft, our air power in terms of fighting firefires. New vehicles, extra costs for more firefighters. But it's part of the whole broader civil defense type of civil protection type of measures.
And so finally, is there something you believe is crucial for individuals to understand when it comes to the worldwide consequences of wildfires, including the impacts on the environment, society, and potential economic implications?
Well, I think the average person, first of all, needs to be a lot more activated and a lot more sensitive to this phenomenon because I mean I'm in New York City, and recently there was a huge fire in Canada. It was about maybe 1,000 miles from here, or maybe not so much, maybe 800 miles from here. But the cloud was such that it for 3 days the Northeast was just choked up. Uh, so we're not first of all, we're not immune to any of this. You don't have to live near forested areas to be touched by the implications of huge fires. Secondly, it seems to me that the awareness is important because the sooner people, especially in such huge expanses like you have in North America, the sooner you're able to alert the authorities, and the sooner they're able to respond and contain the blaze, the better it is for everyone. So people need to be aware of that. The third is beyond the climate change, which is, it's a very big issue, but every single person has a certain responsibility when they go camping, for example, to make sure that, if they light a fire, that it's put out properly, and they make sure that there are no burning coals under that. It's something that initially a lot of the fires in Cyprus were the result of people barbecuing or farmers clearing dry weeds and leaves, etc. And all of a sudden you have a gust of wind and just sparks it on, and you have a big issue. So it's important for people, for the individual, to know that they really need to secure their little bit of the world from potential bigger blaze.
So first of all, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really appreciate it. And for all of you tuning in, I hope this discussion has piqued your interest about wildfires, particularly in the terms of their global effects and how countries collaborate to address this challenge to the best of their abilities. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Before we head off, we have Sienna Yin with a quick how to get involved around town and volunteering opportunities.
Hey everyone, this is Sienna coming to you with some upcoming opportunities to get involved. Splash Houston, or Stopping Plastics and Litter Along Shorelines in Houston, is having a beach park cleanup where they will be removing fishing line and other trash items that impact birds and sea turtles at Seawolf Park in Galveston on Saturday, November 18th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Parking is waived for all volunteers. To register for this park cleanup, head over to splash.tx.org. That's splash.tx.org. Don't forget to sign the digital waiver. If you want to learn more about Splash Houston or have any other questions about their cleanup events, visit their website or email them at splashtx@abcbirds.org. Launched in 2020 through a powerful collaboration between the American Bird Conservancy, Gulf Coast Bird Observatory, and Black Cat GIS, Splash Houston is tackling the dual challenge of trash pollution and bird conservation in the greater Houston-Galveston region. Recent research has shed light on a serious issue. Texas is facing a trash pollution problem, and it's urgent. Did you know that trash accumulates on our Texas coast 10 times faster than it does in other Gulf states? According to a report from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and Ocean Conservancy, Texas has the highest average weight of trash debris per mile surveyed in the entire nation. Texas is home to 600 bird species, the second highest in the U.S. But unfortunately, our coastal ecosystems, crucial for their breeding habitat and migrations, are under threat. Whether it's a bird entangled in a plastic fishing line, a nest constructed with a discarded net, or a bird ingesting plastic, the trash on our coast presents a serious challenge for these creatures, and for all of us. So join Splash Houston at Seawolf Park this Saturday from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. and help make an impact. I hope you guys have a great and wonderful day.
Thanks, Sienna. Up next time on Gulf Streams, we're talking with two officials from the city of Houston, Margaret Wallace Brown, who's Director of Planning and Development for the city, and David Fields, who is the city's Chief Transportation Officer. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email me at westont@rice.edu. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston.
This is KPFT Houston.